We know that much of the world is drowning in an ocean of hyperpalatable, addictive fakery masquerading as food. Much of that fakery has fed our disconnect with natural food production cycles and practices. And it's left most of us in a big food muddle: moral, environmental, nutritional. I'm calling this episode of The Big Middle James Connolly's Food System Fixes. To New York City we go. Hi, James.
Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for having me on.
I want you to burnish your credentials. Why the heck am I asking you? You're not a biochemist, you're not an agronomist, but food has been your life, and fixing our messed up food system has very much been your recent years of activity. Tell us about some of your ventures.
I would like to start out by saying that food was never really something that I actually gave much thought about. And I think one of the sort of genius aspects of modern day society is that we actually don't think about food all that much. We have so much convenience in our modern food system that we can almost believe that it sort of appears out of nowhere. We can see with a lot of the farmers' protests that are happening in Holland right now. One of the more interesting aspects of that is that people are actually surprised that farmers are protesting at all. And so what we have is a modern day civilization that is based off of food and our ability to feed ourselves. And so thank you so much for having me on. I kind of want to start out my first job was at a butcher shop. I started when I was about 14 years old. I did that for about 4 years. Nobody ever taught me how to quit a job, so I couldn't figure out how to quit. So I joined the military. It was the only way I could leave. And it was an old fashioned sort of Irish butchery. These guys were trying to compete with the larger supermarkets, and people were sort of moving in droves towards the supermarket system. It had been around for about 50 years and was hemorrhaging money when I first came on. So I didn't actually think about it all that much. It was a job. Now I think about it in terms of all of the aspects of how I got my hands in the food system from a very early age.
Because I should say at the outset, you're a producer for Sacred Cow, the documentary, nutrition documentary, which advocates for real food and fixing what's wrong with food systems. So I'll just plop that in there now, since I didn't sort of do a fulsome intro on you. And I noticed on Sacred Cow, because of course I watched it and all of the pro-plant vegan ones as well, What the Health and Cowspiracy and Game Changer and all of those, which we can tuck into later as our second course. But first of all, in the butcher shop, that's how Sacred Cow opened, which I thought was an inspired opening for a film that was trying to connect people again to how food is produced.
Yeah, and Dierendank's butcher shop in Belgium, he's sort of a superstar. I remember we were flying out after we had done our filming, and he was in this 18-foot banner at the airport. You see, sort of a superstar in Belgium. He's a multi-generational butcher, kind of went into it kicking and screaming, maybe in the same way that I did. He's a really interesting guy. He wants to be part of the entire process, and he wants to show what that process looks like to his customers. And so there's windows in the abattoir. There you can see everything being cut up in the background. It's one of the most beautiful butcher shops I have ever walked into. Just the sheer abundance of different foodstuffs that are coming from animals.
14 through 18, very impressionable formative years. You were working in the butcher shop, and then you went in the military. And then fixing what was wrong with food being slopped onto trays in inner city schools in New York became your life's work for a time.
Yes. I, again, went into it kind of kicking and screaming. I started a foundation in my early 30s centered around primarily what we wanted to do was kind of, how would you describe it? Like the French and the Italians don't really teach nutrition. They just teach people to love food. I had gone to French Culinary Institute. I had studied at a number of different restaurants, one in England, which was a 2 Michelin star restaurant. I never wanted to move into the food industry, especially be a chef, but I wanted to go and take all of this knowledge and primarily work with high school students, mainly in the inner city. We wanted to kind of teach these kids about where their food was coming from, but also have them be part of a process that everything in our modern education system is so abstracted. food is one of those things that you can take all these like raw ingredients and put them together and make something and feed a community, feed yourselves, feed your family. But bringing 30 chef's knives into the inner city was a legal nightmare. So,
so you were bringing the knives in to show the students the processing.
No, I wanted them to do a version of the French Culinary Institute, or like a modern day version of that in the schools. The kids would be, in essence, breaking down vegetables, breaking down foods, making them, cooking them in the classroom. And, we used to have that. It was called home economics, sort of slowly gotten rid of. And so we wanted to create something modern that was sort of highlighting some of the issues concerning food. But we also wanted to talk to a new generation of kids who are growing up in a food system that's so predatory that when you walk out of the public schools, what you're walking to is probably the most ultra hyper palatable food, landscape you've ever experienced in your life. $5 pizzas with 2-liter Cokes, all for $5. I mean, $4.99.
Yeah, the world at large talks about the monster portions, the oversized portions of the United States. But look, I mean, the UK isn't far off. 60% of the share of your food dollar goes into hyperpalatable processed foods, ultra processed foods in the United States. Well, we're resting at 50% in the UK. And, I take your point. In France, where I lived and where I'm moving to in the very near future, it's 14% there. I mean, people, as you say, when you were at the French Culinary Institute, people learn nutrition by honoring and revering food and the processing thereof and the eating thereof. And it's a big social event, the cooking of it, the consuming of it. Whereas in this country, it's all not for the people who are awake to good nutrition, but there are far too many trays of microwavable this and that with all kinds of emulsifiers and rubbish in it. And it's the same in New York. Every 2 minutes, you've got a fast food outlet, don't you?
Oh yeah, insomnia cookies. 24 hours a day, you can get cookies. There's just every niche has been filled, and so when you look at especially the ultra processed food industry, we actually don't produce enough children, produce enough offspring for them to be able to make quarterly and yearly, profits. And so what they started to do is they really started to manufacture foods that your body wouldn't recognize as food. They sort of break down very quickly in the mouth. They have a sensational feel, but you can eat an entire box of Oreos and your body's not going to recognize it as food. And so they would figure out new and inventive ways to get the same consumer to consume more and more calories by essentially sort of breaking down the satiety system. And they've done this for a very long time, but it really kind of got moving in the 80s into the 90s. And we saw an explosion in the epidemic of what used to be a disease of affluence, like type 2 adult onset diabetes, which I still want to call it because that's what it used to be, is now type 2 diabetes. And so you have all of this metabolic dysfunction in the States. You have all of these kids who are being brought up in a landscape, in an ecosystem that thinks that this is normative. Reward centers, and they were giving out donuts for COVID vaccines. Remember?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have this system, and one of the things was my nonprofit was centered around two basic principles. One is get kids out of the tray and hand system that is part of the U.S. military, our educational system, and our penal system. You walk up with a tray in hand, you have no relationship to where the food is coming from, how it's prepared, and get kids to really understand that there's a different norm to that. But we also wanted to fix the food system in what was being prepared in the kitchen. And so what we did over the course of a number of years, we figured out a way to make it actually cost neutral to have a chef in-house to get ingredients from the same purveyors who are making all this ultra processed junk, but get the raw materials to make it in-house.
And you did it for dollar to dollar, same price.
Dollar to dollar in some of the poorest congressional districts in America that we were working in. And so what I started to get more and more frustrated with the institutional sort of lackadaisical attitude towards food, because you talk about, if you listen to a lot of podcasts about nutrition, you find these people incredibly book smart, really like well-learned individuals who are focused on it because it actually allows you to be able to focus for long periods of time. If you are working through a system of sugar highs and sugar lows, micronutrient deficiencies, macronutrient deficiencies, right? Most of our foods are just refined carbohydrates and ultra palatable like sugars and all this other stuff. Then you sit a kid in a classroom for 8 to 10 hours a day. Most of the kids that we were working with were dropped off between 7:30 and 8 o'clock in the morning, and they were picked up at 6 p.m. at night, 5 days a week. They were getting close to 60% of their food was coming from the DOE. It could be total
Department of
junk.
Education.
Yes, sorry, the Department of Education. It could be total junk, or it could actually fulfill what the nutritional dietary guidelines were supposed to do when they were initially started out. And so we worked with the White House. We worked with Michelle Obama's Let's Move program, which was highly problematic because I'm not the type of person to kind of sit there and glory in, administrations and the way that they think. But like one of the stories that I always tell is, so Michelle Obama actually signed her Let's Move program, inaugurated it with the Pepsi companies and a lot of the ultra processed food companies standing with her on the podium on the same day that President Obama signed the Farm Bill, which is one of the largest corporate giveaways that we have, just in terms of subsidies. And we built into the system a way of managing our taxpayer dollars and throwing it at all of these food concoctions that are then reprocessed and then made into what is the modern day supermarket food. I think it's between 20 and 40,000 different new foodstuffs are produced by the ultra processed food industry every year. Different ways to hook you with the same 3 or 4 different ingredients: corn, wheat, soy, sugar. Yeah. And so, they're always trying new flavor combinations, always trying to figure out how to market this stuff to your children, how to be at every event that you have that delivers a nostalgic and emotional response. That's why baseball games, football games, every single event that you go to nowadays, you will find these companies there. So you associate those feelings of joy and intense emotions with the foods that you're eating. And they know they can create customers for life. They know that the Pepsi drinker is a Pepsi drinker for life. They know that if they can get you hooked early enough on, at 4 years old, they will have a customer for life. And so, you just following the same marketing strategies. I was trying to educate the Department of Educational system, the parents, and in some ways the children outside of that system. And I realized about halfway through the program, I was like, this is not an education problem. This is a society level problem that is something you can't particularly educate yourself out of.
It's like a hydra-headed monster, the way I see it. The industry's in control. It's like the corporate capture of everything that is done related to food. It's been overwhelming and complete. And, you just said Michelle Obama standing beside CEOs, executives of Pepsi. And Pepsi are one of the biggest promulgators of the issues, putting too much sugar in sodas and getting all the kids hooked on it. And, they go to the game with dad on the weekend and they have Pepsis, and then they have other manufactured junk, hot dogs. And what do they put in the buns? Mostly just refined flour, and mush it into some formulation that resembles bread. With bread, which is sugar. The thing is, though, you had all of this. And did you have sort of a Jamie Oliver, who is a chef here, who's done a lot of crusading for real food? Did you have a big profile within your Bubble Foundation? Was there an effort with Michelle Obama on board where you could replicate this throughout the different states?
We couldn't get traction. To be honest, we really couldn't get traction with the amount of work that we were doing on shoestring budgets. To the barrier for change was never the schools. The schools were all on board. We had a lot of young principals who fundamentally wanted to deal with this. The children were never the barrier for change. everything that we introduced them to was a joy in their world. Modern academic education is so abstract and so hard for kids. We've gotten rid of physical education. It's mandated maybe 45 minutes a week. And so as we've sort of moved our educational system to this hyper-focused STEM education, we've removed all of what I would say is sort of an ancestral joy,
Yes,
that is part of
yes.
our world. Time and sunshine. Like, we have a modern day surveillance system that happens with our kids, so kids can never fall behind. I never would have survived that. I hid in plain sight for a very long time. So,
Yeah, as many of us did. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you will find the exportation of that modern system throughout the world nowadays. You can look at. I'll give it a small example: the Blue Zones diet, which is a semi-ridiculous diet, but now is being sort of pushed as endlessly. Yeah. Went to Okinawa was one of the study programs there. I think at this point, Okinawa per capita has more fast food restaurants than any other place on the planet.
And a huge obesity problem. Yeah, they've imported the American style that I saw your next film. Well, one of them, well, it's already out. It's, Where We Invade Next. Michael Moore, you financed that. What was it called? Where Do We Invade Next?
Where to Invade Next.
Where to Invade Next. Yeah. And that drew a fine point on all of this. Wherever America exports its guidelines, people get fat, they get sick, they get incredibly unhealthy. And I mean, where's the way back to nature with all of this?
Yeah, it was one of the first films that we financed. We were not producers on the film. We ended up financing what is their, in essence, sort of advertising and marketing push right before the film had come out. And part of the reason why we wanted to kind of talk about, there's a myriad number of factors that go into health. We'll call it health. We in the West and primarily in the United States, we have a carceral system that is so pure punishment. That in essence sort of makes hyper criminals. We've known this since the 60s. If you want to take a non-violent, maybe somebody who's addicted to drugs who gets put into our carceral system, they will come out worse off than they ever would have been. But we have known for a very long time that we have a social system that could produce the best for as like a happiness hypothesis. What is modern day living? What is the best way that we could possibly live? We have some of the lowest vacation rates in the world, vacation time in the world. So we highlighted Italy, which has somewhere around 6 weeks of vacation a year, plus this thing called the 13th month.
Yeah, we had that in Switzerland as well, and in France. The 13th month paycheck. And I just tell everyone, find this film, Where to Invade Next with Michael Moore. And it really, you'll be happy you live in Europe if you do, honestly. Because the incredulity of the Italian couple, they just couldn't believe it, and the maternity care. I mean, this is the thing. America thinks it's got all the answers, but I mean, that's a little bit off point. I want to get you back to the food angle, because after the Bubble Foundation, I understand that got wrapped into a larger nonprofit that was quite active. And then you went on to get into documentaries. And Sacred Cow, it's very hard to find. And Netflix said no. I mean, I looked on Netflix. I could see Seaspiracy, Cowspiracy, What the Health, Game Changers easily. Couldn't find Sacred Cow. I mean, I had to ask you for a link to it. Tell us about that, how difficult it was to get it out there in the mainstream.
There was almost a Kiss the Ground also came out in and around the same time. And it went into some of the same issues. We'd originally thought that we could actually do a 1-2 punch with Kiss the Ground and Sacred Cow. Our film was always, it was farmer led. From the very beginning. It doesn't have the same methodology that documentaries use nowadays. It's sort of like the spiracy part of it, right? I remember from Cowspiracy where they're interviewing somebody and the filmmakers, the guy who's interviewing him was like, I can't believe you're still alive, you know. And so it doesn't follow along these same principles that are meant to kind of like bring people into this emotional experience of this idea that you're finding out the quest for truth.
Yeah, it's like the
What we
bean
wanted to do.
burritos and the beef burritos in Game Changers. All you
Oh
guys
God,
that are eating the beef burrito, say goodbye to your erections. I mean,
right?
really, it was unbelievable, some of the slop
Yeah.
that came out in that, and yet, sorry, James Cameron, I didn't find any balance in your film. It was all one sided. Same with Kip Anderson's What the Health. I mean, it just
Hmm.
had an agenda and drove it through. Whereas Sacred Cow, it has a different tone to it, a different pace, and they're real conversations with the people, not these staccato MTV frantic style music video, frantic cutting between people to make, a hyperbolic point.
Yeah, and if you do have the time, I think it's actually worth finding an older podcast. It has Nicolette Nyman on. It's a Climate One podcast, and it has one of the film producers for Cowspiracy, sort of debating the merits of animal agriculture and the problems of it. There's a number of other people who are on the panel. It's definitely worth listening to actually hear a conversation between vegan filmmakers and Nicolette, who is a rancher,
And
who
sorry, what is the podcast called? Climate 001?
uh,
What?
Climate One, ONE, and I think you could just look up Nicolette Nyman; it'll show on there. But the interesting part about it is it happens towards the end in the Q&A, where a number of the people who are interviewed in Cowspiracy stand up and they say to the filmmaker for Cowspiracy, you directly manipulated our interviews. You changed the narrative. You made us look the way that look like the villains of this. And so it's a really, and he doesn't have much to say about that. He knew what he was doing. For us, for Sacred Cow, we actually released all of our interviews in totality. If you were part of the film, you can actually go onto our website and look at the entire interviews.
That's
Of course, you're
fantastic.
editing. Of
That's
course, you're
fantastic.
changing these
Yeah.
things. With our new film, Death in the Garden, we're doing exactly the same thing. We're putting out all of the podcast interviews in their totality. We will have to edit it. We will have to take those things out of context to build a narrative. It happens in film. I'm sorry,
No,
but if you
people
want to
need to
delve deeper
understand the
into,
editing process. Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
I was years in television, and you can't put the whole thing, and people have to understand you're not putting out Encyclopedia Britannica here, folks. And it's not the final word, War and Peace on it. But I lived in Sacred Cow, before we get into Death in the Garden, the Mexican farmer who was grabbing a cow pat that had grown a little tiny mushroom, and it was holed. There were lots of holes by dung beetles. And it was he who said, what the director Diana Rogers, she's amazing, the woman behind Sacred Cow, and she's off now. What is her organization called? The Global Food Alliance?
Global Food Justice Alliance, I think it's called.
There we go. But he said it's not the cow, it's the how, which was fantastic. And he'd rehabilitated a vast area of Mexico and made the soil strong again with many microbes and many dung beetles by grazing cattle on the land.
Yeah, and dung beetles are keystone species, meaning like in the absence of having dung beetles around, those cow patties will not be broken into. So they will create the first kind of tunnels that'll move through that allow for other bugs and microbes to be able to move in, break down those patties, and turn it into the nitrogen and nutrition that the grasses need in order to continue growth. And so, for us, some of the interesting parts are the parts that you kind of miss, right? There's a scene in Alejandro's farm where he shows a fence that is going over this cavern. It almost looks like the beginning of the Grand Canyon. This used to be fence land. Whatever it was before it was desertified, you would have a landscape that didn't have these gorges in them. But what ends up happening is you get these large rainstorms that come in. The water can no longer be held on the land. And so it produces, it has to go where it's the most effective, easiest path that it takes. And so it always goes down the same place. It builds over a course of like 30 or 40 years. It can build these gorges because it'll just break through that land. What the water should be doing on that land is holding and then being absorbed by the plants, but then also being reabsorbed into the ecosystem so that it can build up ground aquifers so plants can continuously pull water from that system if they go through longer periods of drought.
Yeah, it was amazing watching that. Very emotional, very emotional.
Yeah.
And you could see the love for his land. No, I almost had tears in my eyes because I thought, well, this guy is giving his life to restoring the soil. And I mean, from what you're telling me, the ground must have been like concrete. Nothing was getting through except in this one spot.
Yeah, it'll build hardpan. The cattle can come on there, break up that hardpan to allow for the proper sort of ecological system to come in to allow what is in essence a seed bank that exists underneath that land to grow up. And we've actually seen that on farms. We've seen agricultural grasses that haven't been seen in 100 years, 150 years start to sprout up by putting animals back on the land and creating the right ecosystem, the right function. Those seeds they're mentally dormant, but they were co-evolved with herbivores. They co-evolved with large herbivores like woolly mammoths. And so unless you get that degree of compaction, then a lot of those grasses still consider it to be the wrong time to sprout. And
so they're just trapped under this hard pan. That's the terminology I didn't have. So they're trapped under this hard pan, just waiting for some ruminants to come along and release them and get the ecosystem thriving again, get some biodiversity going.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I mean, for us, the film itself is a primer, right? We want to draw you to the book. The book will go into a lot more information. It is in no way an answer to any part of this, the ecological and climate conundrum that we have. But it's, for us, it was a really interesting premise. So let me tell you about other films that I've done. I did a film called Bloodroot, and it's an interesting film. It follows these two women who were sort of born and raised in the 50s. Their whole goal in life at the time was to find a husband and move to Westchester and build a family and all that stuff. They discovered the National Organization of Women. They became radicalized. They said, why am I following this Stepford Wives life that brings me no joy? And they found each other, and they created this partnership, and they built a restaurant. It was a vegetarian restaurant in a very poor industrial community in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And so part of the reason why we funded that was because we're not antagonistic to vegetarianism. We've never been antagonistic, but we are antagonistic to this divide that seems to be the only thing that exists right now. It's either animal-based or it's plant-based. It's so utterly ridiculous if you study agricultural systems. Monoculture seems to be the biggest problem that we have, whether it's chickens or almonds or avocado farms or any number of different things. When you build a system that is based on that, you in essence have to destroy everything on the environment to grow the food. You have to bring in and import enormous amounts of resources, enormous amounts of water. You drain aquifers. You build the system that has no resiliency other than excising this stuff from all different parts of the planet. Fertilizers, pesticides, agrochemicals, all of that stuff. It seems monoculture is the thing. So, for us, Bloodroot was a really interesting idea because it talks about the long-term effects of a revolutionary spirit. These women don't really have they don't really have a pension, They've been fighting this fight for a very long time. And they were irreverent and and great on camera, and
I didn't
and they
see
tell
that
a
one.
really interesting story.
Yeah, I'm going to have to get into that because I just want to explain too. I met you on Twitter, and I can't thank you enough for carrying the can because the interview I did just before this one with Jane Buxton, former management consultant, journalist, author of The Great Plant-Based Con, it generated a lot of action on Twitter. And I was out of my depth with some of the criticisms that were coming in. And I really appreciated you carrying the can for me on that because the depth and breadth of your knowledge. No, because I didn't feel comfortable rebutting some of the points. I mean, my biggest thing is the bridge that we need to build is real food, between all of the squabbling tribes, the dietary tribes. You are just the person to tell us how we got here. Public health is in dire shape. We've got an obesogenic environment with the hyperpalatable foods and people reaching for them. But there's this cloak of opacity that sits all over everything, and people are not connecting the dots like you are. I want to get into some of that with you because you are brilliant at connecting the various pieces. I want to take us back to the Civil War in the United States. Long before Ancel Keys arrived to completely throw us off course and build on the diabetes pandemic, which has now been exported around the world with the manufactured foods. You can tell us what happened after the Civil War and this need to create more food.
So there were two things that kind of happened post Civil War. You had Reconstruction, that one of the stipulations that ended up at the end of the Civil War was something called 40 acres and a mule. Black farmers, dispossessed Black farmers, were promised 40 acres and a mule. President Johnson immediately got rid of that. If he gave away any land to Black farmers at all, it was taken away from Native American tribes. What ended up happening was post Reconstruction lasted for maybe about 10 years. What ended up happening after that was the forced dispossession of a lot of land that farmers were able to somehow get their hands on. And this really culminated in the 20th century, where you had, at the beginning of the 20th century, you had about 1 million Black farmers in America. These are people who, over the course of the past 400 years, were the main storehouses of the agricultural movement in America. These are the people working the land, people who had deep knowledge of how to farm and how to do it well. But the soils were definitely getting exhausted. One of the things about the agriculture, and Jefferson complains about this, but you can go as far back as civilization. The beginning of civilization, the exhaustion of the land and the degradation of soils means that you, in essence, have to create a colonialist expansion into new lands. And we're seeing this in the global South now. We're seeing the financialization of a lot of farmland, in essence, taken from the global North. So let's backtrack a little bit. The Industrial Revolution is happening. People are being forced into the cities. You actually see this in England as well. The closing of the commons. You see people being shuttled into there. The Great Migration happens in America, which is Black farmers and Black people in the in the U.S. South are just done. They're done with the terrorism. They're done with the KKK. They're done with all this stuff, and they decide to move up north. You have about 4 million Black families that move to the industrial areas. As you get this move into this industrial system, you have people moving further and further away from where food is grown. And so you get to create these movements that then become these sort of semi-religious, mostly religious movements that are centered around this idea of vegetarianism and creating a utopia. And so they're mostly urbanized people who then will sort of, and you see a lot of the adulteration of food really start to happen now.
This is the Seventh-day Adventists, and then young John Kellogg, who worked for them, that whole story.
Yes, it starts with Sylvester Graham. It starts with Louisa May Alcott's father. It starts with a number of different movements. If you really want to get into it, some of it actually starts with a pseudoscience that was originated in Europe, but then became hugely popular in the States, called phrenology. Phrenology was a study of the bumps of people's heads. And so it was mainly a driver of character, right? Character was equivalent to intelligence at the time. So if you wanted to talk about the key characteristics of a person, you would feel their head. And all of it was sort of aligned around this idea of this perfect European head, right?
So plants-only heads were different than those filthy meat eaters.
Well, sort of. You get into this kind of purity movement that happens in and around this time. Let me see if I can kind of talk about this in a way that I don't want to lose your audience. Phrenology was so popular at the time that it actually sold 5 times more than On the Origin of Species by Darwin by the end of the 19th century. So this was a huge movement, and it was followed by a number of different people. It was centered around this idea that you can create the perfect human being, and so the purity of foods meant character building. And so if you can remove yourself from the blood and the offal and all of the stuff that is associated with animal agriculture or even just farming in general, you could somehow create this utopian civilization. And not all of their ideas were wrong. They were abolitionists. They were really working for in some ways for women's rights, for women's suffrage. They were anti-temperance. What is it? Non-drinking. There were temperance movements. But a lot of it was centered around this idea that you could somehow create this new Garden of Eden that would bring about the second coming of Jesus. And so we don't necessarily study a lot of that stuff because it seems sort of like a revivalist, strange period of time in history. But it was centered around this industrialization that then becomes what is our modern day food system. As you move people further and further away from where their food is coming from, you can then say, well, the animal is unnecessary to an integrated farming system. We can build all of these inputs for farms that don't involve animals anymore. And it's always been semi-ridiculous. As kind of a secondary story to this, there was, ever heard of the term batshit crazy?
Yeah, I've said it. I'm sure it's jumped out of my mouth many times. In Canada, it was a popular phrase.
Okay. So batshit crazy came about because there was a second slavery movement that happened in places in Peru and in South America, Chile and stuff like that, because they were taking concorminate and bat guano and bird guano that had been building up for centuries on these atolls. It provides a lot of nitrogen that could be used for fertilizers. And so they created this global trade network centered around this. And it was excising it from these places. It took thousands of years to grow and bringing it into Western Europe, into the Americas to grow, because we had obviously degraded the land over a long period of time. And so shoveling all of this bad shit over a long enough period of time, these people, it had some degree of toxicity and they would actually go insane. And so we had created this movement. We were slowly starting to run out of this nitrogen fertilizer.
I wondered where you were going with that.
Okay.
Okay, this is fascinating.
So you go into the early part of the 20th century and people are saying we're going to be starving. Malthusian ideas about overpopulation start to grow. You start to get into this frenzy around the idea that we will have starving people going into the 20th century. And so this frenzy is sort of created around this. A novel process called Haber-Bosch is invented. He is probably responsible for about half of the people who live on this planet now. He was able to take nitrogen from the air and through a process fix it so that it was bioactive and utilizable in agriculture. If he had not been able to do that, he obviously won Haber and Bosch had won the Nobel Prize for their work. It changed the entire landscape of our food system. It built upon that, but it also requires enormous amounts of energy. It requires enormous amounts of, and there is a cost to building that much nitrogen and throwing it onto the land.
And now we're throwing it onto all the land, aren't we? I mean,
into our waterways. So if climate change wasn't the thing we were focusing on right now, nitrogen would be the thing. So that's how much of a problem it is, but also how much our system has been inundated with nitrogen. You need nitrogen to grow plants.
You sent me a sizzle reel from your next documentary, Death in the Garden. Now, it opened with a powerful observation that all so-called solutions for global warming have one thing in common. They take industrial capitalism as a given, and the natural world has to conform to industrial capitalism. This is taken as read. So I want you to speak to that a little bit more about how industrial agriculture subsumed nature.
Yeah, there's a really, really wonderful book by an author by the name of Charles Mann. It's called The Wizard and the Prophet. And the way he describes, he said that the question of the 20th century has been bandied about by two different ideas. One is Norman Borlaug's idea, which is the wizard idea, that we will be able to always, through human engineering and ingenuity, solve every problem that our own civilization creates. And then William Vogt, who was sort of centered around this idea that we have to work within the limits of the structure of the boundaries of the earth. And so those two competing ideas have, in essence, been the back and forth of the 20th century. And he goes into enormous detail about these two individual characters, but he also goes into an incredible amount of detail about soil health, nitrogen, feeding ourselves, water. It's such a wonderful book. I've read it 4 times already. Every single time I've listened to it or read it, I learned something new. And it's really centered around this idea. We have had a sort of a conservation movement that says we need to work within the boundaries of what nature is. And we have this wizard movement that will always say that we can, the car was created to deal with the horse shit problem. So at the end of the 19th century, the newspapers are saying that the New York City would be filled with 7 feet of horse shit. If population expanded and a number of immigration continued. So we invented the car. Now we deal with the car problem, the transportation problem, all of those things. So the wizard idea is that we're just going to be able to kind of work ourselves out of this. I would say that was ascendant for most of the 20th century.
It's in the fore now, because we see it's like deja vu again and again and again. And it's why I think all of the arguments from vegans, or I know the terminology must be plants only people now, and it's been rebranded. So I learned that from Jane. Anyway, the thing is, though, with all of this, I want to get to why so many people are swallowing the ultra-processed plants-only food messaging now. It's ubiquitous. And I mean, I want everyone just to eat real food and get back to that. And, not be eating things in boxes and packets with 89 ingredients on them and emulsifiers and all of this. The wizard. No, we don't need to go down that route. But I want you, because I've called this James Connolly's food system fixes. I know you were a vegetarian for a time. I was a vegetarian for at least 10 years. I can't really add them all up. And I was ruthless about it. There was no meat. I was 0 fat, all the rest. And that grew out of my disgust at the industrialized animal cruelty. Do we have a hope in hell, James, do you think, of moving away from the big scale industrialized abuse and slaughter of sentient animals? Because unless we have movement and progress on that score, I think when I talk to plants only people, because they haven't been hit yet by the health turbulence that you get after 10 years and your hair is falling out in your teeth and you're completely tired all the time, a lot of people turn back to omnivory because of this. But if we don't start treating animals better, honoring the animals like you tried to show in Sacred Cow, figuring out a way not to be killing so many animals willy-nilly and putting them in confined, stressed out, abhorrent conditions. I mean, where is the progress on that? Because you're the guy who would be seeing it.
I want to preface this with one thing, and I want to be very clear on some of the aspects of this. The fact that we feed over 7 billion people on this planet is an absolute miracle in so many different ways. There have been a number of scientists, and we'll never get these true heroes, people who've been able to keep up with the level of population growth and feed people. And we still consider it abhorrent when we see famine and we see stunting. And used to be during famines, you'd lose about 15% of a population of a nation state. Now it's down to about 1%, and we still consider that to be an absolutely horrendous disaster. And so I never want to vilify the farming community, because I think what they've done is an admirable job of feeding the world. They're part of that system is to think of these biological beings that have their own, that can suffer, is to build that level of efficiency into the system that brings as much protein and fats and all of the other stuff that is associated with animals to the consumer. The consumer doesn't want that. If you poll consumers, they don't want factory farming. Every time they see it, they see the ecological damage to it. They're somewhat against it. We were never really given a choice in this.
And the farmers aren't either. Big livestock took over. So small mixed farmers, they were not given a choice either, were they?
Yeah. So the way I like to describe that is there's a book, Winona Hauser's book. It's been a while since I read this one. I remember the author's name, and we can put it in the show notes if you want. She describes it in a very distinctive way. She said, if you want to become a chicken farmer, you want to go for a bank loan. You build the specs according to, say, Pilgrim's Pride or Tyson. You build the housing according to their specs.
So these are big brand chicken farming operations in the US. These two names.
But these are farmers who have land and they want to transfer their land. Maybe they're multi-generational families. They want to build maybe a chicken system, and so they have to build to these specs in order to get a business loan. The business loan is built upon that. They buy their chicks from, say, Tyson, and they buy the feed from Tyson. I don't know if they buy the antibiotics, but probably. And they will house and take care of those chickens and then sell that back to Tyson afterwards. And there's a lot of price collusion among the major meat production units, which are about 4 now in the United States. So that's how much the meat production side of it has consolidated over the years.
How come well-meaning people haven't been able to get any traction at breaking up some of this monopolistic behavior? They're so large and powerful that small farmers just can't get a look in.
So the former CEO of ADM, Archer Daniel Midland, which is a commodities exchange, and a number of different things are involved in, he made a statement in the 70s. He said, we want to believe that the US is a capitalist system. It's actually socialism. It's socialism for us, for the rich. And so what they've done is they've built into the system a revolving door among the Department of Agriculture and Monsanto and Cargill and ADM and all of that stuff. So former CEOs will go then work for the Department of Agriculture, and then they go back and get huge bonuses from these companies. And it's been taken away from the farmers are in essence sort of in a feudal state, if you would say, because they have no control over their land anymore. It's in essence sort of owned by the bank. And they're cycled in this level of debt. But this chicken farmer now sells his chicken back to them. So if you then go buy out and buy a KFC bucket of chicken, that farmer gets about a quarter of that. Everybody else
subsistence farming by any other name, and the small farmer just trying to make ends meet has no control over his livelihood.
Yeah, and that is agricultural policy that was set up by Nixon in the 70s. It's called Get Big or Get Out. It further consolidated under Trump's Department of Agriculture. Sonny Perkins, I think his name is. He also said the same thing. He's get big or get out. So when he finally retires, he leaves, and I think it was ADM bought him a grain mill, gave him a grain mill. It's like you're taken out of the equation. The consumer has no real choice in this, right? They walk to the supermarket and they think that what they're getting is a variety of products, but really it's just wholly owned by about 13 multinational corporations now that control about 90% of our system. And so, blaming the consumer, a lot of the stuff that kind of happens afterwards where you shame people away from consuming meat, or you say that they're part of the industrial agricultural system, most people wouldn't want to be part of that. And what those guys will say is that they're doing it to bring cheap meat to us.
Yeah.
And
you want prices to go up. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is where it becomes really such a muddle. When you do start to, open the can and look underneath what's in it, you just think, oh my God, how do we ever change anything? I know that in my conversation with Jane, she was talking about this groundswell of small farmers. But if the big operations control all the levers where, Joe and Madge have to make their living and feed their children, there's no room to maneuver. So, and then you flip it the other way. I mean, until we find a way to get everyone thinking in real food terms, as opposed to much of what we see in our supermarkets, all of the eat meat for your health messaging, I think is just lost on vegans because they do not want to murder animals. They just do not want to do that, and they will sacrifice their health for that. And few seem to know the death toll involved, the heavy death toll involved in manufacturing their plants only products. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, and I mean, it's definitely a difficult subject to kind of get into because most of the studies are estimates. We do feed a lot of the agricultural waste, we call it waste, to farm animals, mainly ruminants. So the thing I always go back to is how integrated the system actually is, right? So alcohol production, distillers' grains, a lot of that goes into feedstock. Alfalfa production, which is also a monoculture, goes into feedstock. There is a lot of death associated with that. There's a lot of pesticide use. There's a lot of just general monoculture and dependence upon fossil fuel fertilizers and stuff
And
like
field
that.
animals getting chewed out by the blades of tractors and
On
threshers.
both sides of the equation. On both sides of the equation. We have deforestation that's happening in places like Indonesia for palm oil production, which is used in ultra processed foods. When trans fats had to be forcibly removed from our system because of there seems to be no safe level of trans fats in our diet at all. Whatever, right? Dose makes the poison. The industry pivoted really fast to moving towards palm oil, which is a saturated fat. It will be stable and solid at room temperatures, but can also bake in the oven.
And it's
Huge
in
levels
everything.
of deforestation.
I mean, you look
everything.
at whole
Cosmetics.
and peanut butter. I mean, you have to really be wary about any peanut butter you're going to buy because much of it that's with a whole food plants only label is saturated with palm oil. You have to find the ones that are 100% roasted peanuts.
Yeah, and the cartels involved in Italian citrus production are deadly.
Really?
The same thing with it's pretty scary.
There's an orange mafia underway and a lemon mafia, Sicilian lemons.
Yeah, they're high commodity foods. They're high value commodity foods. Same thing with avocado production. You can see that in Mexico. But you can also see the dispossession of a lot of rangelands for elephants and for migratory like wildebeest happening in Kenya for avocado production. And so like the more you dive into the system, you kind of start to realize like it really is a false dichotomy. Like the back and forth that we were having on Twitter, the part of it was generated because I made this really cheap, awful meme centered around this idea that when we're talking about plant-based, I am talking about Impossible Whopper. I'm talking about like the McPlant sandwich. I am talking about that. I am not talking about like vegetables per se. But
it was a great meme, by the way. Everyone needs to follow you on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle again? It's something unusual. At James.
Yeah, it's James Co Photo. Yeah, so hard on Twitter. Like I don't know. I mean, Twitter's kind of one of those places where like I'll take out some degree of frustration that I have with the way the dialogue is happening nowadays. And so sometimes I'm not my best person.
I loved you. You were so feisty, and you had the knowledge that I didn't. I felt really out of my depth when somebody would say something negative, and I'd think, well, I don't even want to like that, But it was my podcast, and it was generating the comments. And so, no, I really appreciate it because you have dug deep into all of this, and I'm just a student. I'm an early student. Right. I've learned all about keto when I was looking at my own health issues and trying to heal and doing all of that. But I've not really looked at food production. And I am one of the humans always living in an urban environment completely. Yes, I grow vegetables. I grow some rocket and chives and tomatoes, but that's about it. That's my connection with food. Where do we go, though? Is there some sort of organization that you think could be created to support regenerative farmers so that we can get the groundswell of activity and demand going that Jane Buxton spoke of?
Yeah, I think there are a number of great organic farming, regenerative farming institutions that are growing. They're sometimes I worry a little bit about their messaging: eat less meat, just regenerative meat. It seems a bit elitist, and Diana's got a lot of pushback from the community on that. I just find it really problematic, having spent most of my career kind of like working with kids in food insecure communities. You're going to fill the plate with something. And so, I do have a hard time with that. I wouldn't necessarily name any one institution that's doing it particularly well. I know Rodale Institute is doing some really good work. Part of my problem is that like we're constantly doing this kind of, they set the ground rules for what they continue to determine what is sustainable and what is ecologically beneficial. They set the rails by which we can have a conversation about this stuff. And so I just find that really problematic, because you're constantly, it's always a new problem that they'll kind of bring in that you have to then defend. And then it's a constantly moving target that keeps on happening with it. So the methane argument, the land use argument, all of those different things are, should we be eating bugs, right? All of that.
Well, according to Eat Lancet, that's going to be a big part of the diet. Bugs, a teaspoon of meat. What is it? 2 teaspoons of chicken per month? How do you get teaspoons of chicken and a quarter of an egg? I just think, okay, so you'd have to poach an egg, hard poach, boil it, slice. I mean, what is all this about? And this is the real food. And then we had that, I couldn't even keep up with all the things. Nutri-Score, so, all of that stuff.
Yes.
Crazy.
Oh my God. And so a part of it is what you choose not to measure, right? So, and there are 2 points that I kind of want to make here. One is the military is almost exempt from the way that we talk about climate change. Some of the largest fossil fuel emissions in the world, also in terms of ecosystem destruction and just overall just anarchy, that a lot of the sort of our military industrial complex that is symbiotically related to agriculture in so many different ways is exempt from a lot of the measures that we use for that. And I just find that so strange that we have these very left-leaning Eat Lancet organizations that don't talk about military expenditures and the degree to which half of the US's budget goes to the military. And then the secondary part of it is the overall health impacts of what is an obesogenic diet, which is all of our medical system is predicated upon that. A lot of them are metabolic disease diets. If you're going to die today, especially in the West and in the industrialized world, you're going to die from a diet-related disease or some sort of cancer, heart disease.
One of the sugar-fed cancers. Yeah, I mean, the metabolic,
diabetes.
What is it? 85% of the American population, they have some sort of metabolic dysfunction. And we're not far behind in the UK. I don't think it's tracked as much, but we're not far behind. And again, we go back to that, how we opened, the hyperpalatable, ultra-processed fake food. I know I had a vegan staying here for a couple of months, and I mentioned it in another podcast, and all he did was eat crisps. He'd start well. He'd go do calisthenics for an hour at the gym, and then he'd come home and he'd eat something out of a packet. And then all day long, it was things out of packets. I don't know where he got any nutrition at all, but the next day it'd be chocolate bars or, energy bars with really chocolate bars, but, masquerading as energy bars, and big, massive bags of crisps and Krispy Kremes, but they're vegan, and I just, it's funny. The guy had age on his side. He was only 28 years old.
Oh, right.
So he still was in the flush of, fed by all of his good hormones. But I don't know, some vegans, as long as they're not killing animals, but they don't understand that there are animals that are killed in the fields and all through the food production system, which is the point of Death in the Garden, which is coming out soon, isn't it? It's going to lift the curtain on all of this. Yeah.
And, for us, Death in the Garden is also about the modern conservation movement. It's a new form of colonialism. The modern electrifying our grid and electrifying our transportation system, which requires the dispossession of indigenous lands all over this planet. And the amount of water use for lithium, child mining, for cobalt, any number of different things. We still have a system that still requires, by even UN standards, 36 million people living in economic slavery.
Exactly.
And so we're sold this idea that that plant-based or whatever, this new utopia, right? That same 19th century idea. We're building this new utopia, and I'm like, wait a second. You know, Elon Musk says we'll coup any government who doesn't allow us to come in and excise the lithium from there, which he was talking about Bolivia at the time, a democratically elected government. And so this is just a whole new form of imperialism. And you look at the people who are talking about this, and they're always the same guys. So they kind of look like me, right? They're like some, like plus 40, super rich 1%er who spends his time in Davos. And the genuine pushback from people online saying that this is just a new form of the ultra rich people who have unelected or have given us the two people that we get to choose from, the Boris Johnsons. I was there for Brexit. You see the way the Murdochs manipulated the newspapers and everything like that. It flat out lied to people.
The
and
big
people
red
are really
bus.
tired of it.
Yeah.
The big red bus. Remember that?
That big red bus. No, and now, the bills come due and nobody's labeling it Brexit, or, us Remainers are. I worked for a pro-EU political party when I first moved back from Cape Town. And I mean, the message is just lost, though. I mean, people are fed up with the lies. But I just find it incredible that the UK has done this to itself. And it's the poor men of Europe, take two. But listen, James,
can we go back to one thing I wanted to kind of highlight when talking about vegan documentaries? I always find it's really interesting to go on the IMDb profile for them. The IMDb profile is for any film. They'll tell you who the producers are, the director, who the cast is, and everything like that. But the producer credits are very interesting. You'll find out where the financing is coming from, and you'll find when you look into some of the characters, the individuals who were associated with that, you always find the same people kind of popping up in over and over again.
Well, who's bankrolling? Is there one or two? Are there one or two people that's bankrolling most of these documentaries? They're very samey, same roll call of characters.
Right. Yeah, there's always, the young idealistic guy who hops in a van who like goes out on a quest, right? It's sort of you're talking about Telemachus, right?
What the hell?
Telemachus quest to find his father.
Yeah,
or Seaspiracy. Jim Greenbaum is one of the people who's always on the producer list. He is a huge donator to Mercy for Animals. He was a telecom. He's worth over $300 million. He was a telecom guy who retired and is devoting his entire fortune to ending animal agriculture. Another guy in eating to extinction, is Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi prince.
Is this the new Kate Winslet one? I've not.
Yes.
Is it out? Yeah. I've not seen it.
It did. It sort of, I don't know if it got the same degree of fanfare. Cowspiracy was like a big one off. What the Health as well. And the marketing budgets for them are so huge. But Greenbaum is always there. I don't know how much he spends on financing, but it's from an ideological perspective. And what they're trying to do is say, all right, you care about your own individual health. Here's the film for you. You want to be an elite athlete? Here's the film for you. You care about the planet? Here's the film for you. If you care about animals, these are the films that you're going to watch. And so much of it has an ideological bent, which we all do, right? I mean, we all have like our own biases. We have our own way of thinking about the world. But the degree to which the media just tends to think of documentaries as a different form of non-biased journalism is so strange to me.
Yeah, well, we're in the age of Meta and Facebook before it. People don't have the curiosity, the inclination to do any digging whatsoever because the messaging is ubiquitous. It just saturates every single outlet, every platform. And who doesn't after a long day at work or out there in the wild world doing whatever? Who doesn't want to sit down in your pajamas and watch something on Netflix instead of reading the FT or the Economist cover to cover? And even then you'll be getting, some biased journalism as well. I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to cut through to the public and get people curious about where the plants only messaging falls apart. It's I think it's really hard.
Yeah, if you look at a lot of the internal dialogue that happens within market research around plant-based, you'll find that they're willing participants in any activist movement that sells their product. They will use the same visuals, the women's march, or people gathering together. But I don't know if there was a Pepsi commercial that came out a few years ago during Black Lives Matter, shortly after a lot of the protests happening, where they had one of the Kardashian girls saw the protests happening. It's all these beautiful people dancing down the streets and confronting this police mob who are all set up in military, crowd gear and all of this other crowd control gear. And so she walks up and everybody stops and she hands the policeman a Pepsi, I mean, it's just so, oh God, it's just so awful.
I'm so glad I didn't see that. Head in sand, really, never want to see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really bad.
And that you'll see that with Meatless Mondays. You'll see anxiety about climate change. You'll see the utilization of water footprints and land use and any number of different things being set up in schools. You have kids in 6th grade who are looking at this stuff, being shamed into not eating meat. And I have kids. I have 3. The younger generation have all come home saying that they were vegan now.
Are they tender-aged kids that are getting pressured at school to be eating some of the things that you don't want them to eat?
13 and 10. But this was a few years ago. I'd say in and around that 10-year-old age is when they start to gather a lot of that information together, and the social dynamics that happen at school. One kid will do it, and then the next will kind of jump on. And then I'll cook for them and show them what a vegan meal looks like, and they're like, "Okay, I'm good."
You see, depending on who you follow on Instagram too. I mean, people need to follow you on Instagram because you can show what's being presented in the school systems around the world. Packets of this and packets of that, and some little clump that could be spinach. You're not really sure what it is. Same on the hospital trays. I mean, our food systems are out of control, and I really appreciate you coming on and giving us your best ideas for the fixes that we need. But as you say, it's very hard to find the thread you pull to start the unraveling of this matrix that we've got that's so messed up.
Yeah, I would always encourage people to study agriculture. It is, whether you're reading Oscar Wilde to watching the Matrix movies, everything that we have nowadays is predicated on the fact that we can feed ourselves. Everything we can jump around and act like it's not that, and think of political structures that would, in essence, always would fall apart. The Arab Spring was centered around the commodities market manipulating the price of grain. The price increase almost doubled in places like Egypt and Tunisia and stuff like that. In essence, it toppled governments. We saw this with the French Revolution. We have seen this every single time.
Sri Lanka, we just had some issues involving the farmers being denied their living. WEF, World Economic, the Great Reset, and it just feels like more consolidation of wealth to me, more consolidation, centralization of control. The robber barons will live, and the 98% of humanity, or 99%, let's call it, that are struggling, the downtrodden will remain. This Hobbesian, nasty, short, brutish life. It's just, I don't know the way out.
Yeah. So everything that I've given up to this point is descriptions, not prescriptions. And that's always hard. I always want to leave the audience with something. There is one of my best friends describes it as this. He said, a modern society is you raised in a box, in a crib, to sit in a box, which is a classroom, to move into a cubicle, which is another box, and then to move into a coffin, which is your final box. Most people don't want this. They struggle to have anything to do with this. There's a whole generation of kids who want to opt out. They want to spend time in nature. They want to be outdoors. They want to do things that provide, ecosystem benefit, to build upon something that they can see grow in front of them, to nourish their neighborhoods and nourish the people around them. And so I'd implore people who, even if you're raised in cities, like spend some time, think about agriculture, start to spend some more time with farmers. There's a lot of people leaving cities in droves now.
I mean, the pandemic, anybody who has a couple of brain cells to rub together has been reflecting on the way they're living their lives. And less is more is very much the message. Time, that's the valuable commodity.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I'd really like the end of Sacred Cow has this like montage of young farmers who are living their best lives. And I would implore like from all over the globe. And I think it's just really important for people to say, like we should be supporting this. You should be our heroes in many different ways.
I'm so glad that you came on this podcast to give us some ideas about where we went wrong. And I did ask you to draw up a reading list as well.
Okay.
And,
5 books. 5 books freaks me out.
Did it freak you out? It's the one question I gave you in advance. No, because you're so widely read, and I'd be flanneling you here forever. But you said you read 3 books a week. What?
Yes.
I mean, I read the internet too much, clearly. So your 5 books, The Desert Island Question, 5 books for the rest of your life, what would they be?
Nonfiction books is primarily what I read. Fictional books are the ones that have always changed my life. They've always changed my way of viewing the world. I'm going to start out with Daniel Quinn. He's got 2 books, one called Ishmael. Quick story about Daniel Quinn. There was a prize that was given out for a book. It's the largest prize that's been ever awarded for one book. I think it was in the 70s, about a fictional book that could change people's idea about the world. And it was Ted Turner, I think, who had put together the prize. This first-time novelist wrote a book called Ishmael, and it's a conversation about civilization. Between a gorilla and a person who earnestly wants to save the world. Give it a chance; it'll change your world. Wow. One of his secondary books is called "If They Give You Lined Paper, Write Sideways," and it's how to think like a Martian anthropologist. Somebody who wasn't raised in this environment, to see all the absurdities and the weirdness and the strange ideas that we.
Well, I love the title. I'm already there.
Oh, it's so great. So those are the 2 books that I would say are just fundamental. I go back to them all the time. I just think they're just so wonderful, and I'm always learning from them. Always confused by the way that he sees the world. Wizard and Prophet, Charles Mann's book. I would almost make it required reading if I was that type of person who would require reading for people. It is so profound. It's so good. And don't get lost in the details. He always brings you back to the larger story. But even the details, the way he describes them, are just so wonderful. I want to give a fictional book that I just think is so much fun, and it'll teach, like, if you have a kid or who just doesn't like history, if you want to learn about it through a tromp through the 20th century, with a modern day assassin who was kind of raised in feudal Tokyo, feudal Japan, in some sort of weird like story. Trevanian is this writer who I absolutely love. I love all of his work.
Trevanian.
His name is Robert Whitaker. He was for a long time, everybody's like, who is this guy? He lives in the Basque region of Spain, and he only comes out like once a year, and nobody knows who he is.
Love the mythology that's built up around it.
Oh, it's so great. He was a history professor who taught Texas for a long time. He wrote a book called The Crazy Ladies of Pearl Street for any kid who grew up more in their imagination than in the world. It is one of the most beautiful reads. But his book, Shibu Mi, is just such a wonderful, wonderful read.
What was that title?
Shibu Mi. It's a Japanese phrase. It's got a Go board on it. He considers Go to be the only game that's worth playing.
And number 5?
So Plant-Based Con is a really good book. Obviously Jane Buxton, I met her, we had cocktails once. She's really wonderful. But I find that there's a lot of journalists who are pushing back against this, a lot of the fat narrative and fat phobia narrative and the anti-meat narrative. This guy is really far left, and he just wrote a book that just came out, and he actually gets into like Nina Teicholz's Big Fat Surprise, which I was so surprised about. His name is Clifford D. Connor. And just
What do you mean? He gets into it and pokes holes in it?
He talks about the food industry, and he pokes holes in the way the food industry has manipulated the landscape of the way that we talk about nutrition. But he's mainly focused on the military industrial complex, pharmaceutical companies, food, a number of different issues, corruption, and all this other stuff. It's Haymarket Books, which is a big socialist publisher, right. Anarchist socialist publisher. I was really surprised to read it. It's called The Tragedy of American Science from Truman to Trump. And he's just
he falls in step with Nina.
He does.
He supports what she did.
He falls in step with the idea that the processed food industry is totally scapegoating both plant and animal foods, right? Getting scapegoated out of the dialogue. Really,
well, it's a corporate. It's so, to me, transparent. It's a corporate capture routine. Market expansion is the goal, and now they can charge gullible people more for what did someone say in that sizzle reel that you sent, which is available on YouTube? I'm going to put it in the show notes. One of the sound bites, because it was just clips strung together, and he was saying, now that we've committed ecocide, we're getting the kibble from these plant-based manufacturers, or the kibble that used to go to the cattle. We are the cattle now.
Yeah,
we're getting the kibble.
They've decided to take out the middleman and feed us agricultural foodstuffs. We call it upcycling or plant-based butter. It's margarine, right? Yeah, it's so stunning the way that and if anything, the only push that we had in Sacred Cow, because one of the vegan activists asked me whether it was an anti-vegan film, and we had produced an anti-vegan film, and I was like, no, we're just talking about that corporate capture of the idea of moving. They found veganism too off-putting for a lot of people, so they just moved to plant-based. So then plant-based became the de facto terminology we use.
Yeah, who doesn't love a plant? Yeah, absolutely. A flower, a plant, natural living thing. Final words from you. I think you're on the cusp of saying something important. What did you want to say?
I do worry. I do wish the low carb keto and community actually focused a little bit more on what's happening in animal agriculture right now. Rethink X did a paper, and one of the things they said was that the degree to which farmers are kind of holding on to a thread in terms of animal agriculture means that any disruption to the system would mean the whole system would collapse. And I do worry a lot about that, because this is a group that is leveraging a huge amount of power to, in essence, like overthrow a system. I think if we want to fight for real food, we have to understand that these key players are trying to create a landscape by which meat is unaffordable for a significant portion of the world. And I do worry about that a lot, Well,
we need to figure out ways of organizing and amplifying the message that real food is the way to go. Not all this manufactured test tubery that goes on. And, hail the scientists, as you said, nitrogen, all of that. But, we've got to pull back. We've already gone down since Ansel Keys changed the dietary guidelines and nobody questioned. I mean, look at the diabetes pandemic that we've got going on all over the world. We've got to pull back in a more focused way. And I don't have any answers, but I'm so glad that I asked you for your ideas. And as you said, descriptions, but that's okay. I wasn't expecting you to have a fix everything prescription. So thank you so much, James, for coming on.
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Sure.
James Connolly is the producer of the documentary Sacred Cow and Death in the Garden, which should be out. When is that coming out, James? Soon enough?
Maybe next year. Yeah.
Next year. Good.
Unfortunately, these things take a while.
Oh, they do. There's so much to boil down. You are also the co-producer, along with Diana Rogers, the director of Sacred Cow, the Sustainable Dish podcast. And I've only enjoyed a couple of episodes, but I'm definitely following you now so that I can tuck into a lot more. Thank you so much from New York City, James Connolly. I enjoyed this a lot. I learned a lot, which is why I do the Big Middle. And I hope you liked hearing from James as well. And if you do, hop on to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. Ciao for now, James.
Bye.